Torrance Art Museum Registrar and the curator of the exhibition Rewilding Structures. I am joined today by Ashton Phillips, the interdisciplinary artist whose catch and release works were included in the exhibit. For those unfamiliar with the show, I chose to focus on the themes of the Anthropocene, that is, the proposed current geological epoch defined by the significant impacts we're having on our planet. Thank you for joining us today, Ashton. I appreciate you making time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me.
From previous conversations that we've had, it's my understanding that a large portion of your sculptural works are made with contaminated earth, like the earth that we have at the museum in Rewilding Structures, which is then remediated and returned to its excavation site. What is it about this particular material practice that informs your work?
So the dirt is really richly symbolic for me, and it works for me as a kind of metaphor on a couple different levels. The first is as a place of return and rebirth. There's kind of a famous saying about the dirt being the great equalizer. And I think that all of us on a kind of animalistic level can access and interact with it in that way. But it's a place of burial, and it's also a place that records history. But it's also a place of birth. You know, it's a source of new life that, you know, even those of us living in a city have some access to kind of seeing that, even if it's like a weed growing through a crack in the sidewalk. So for me, it works as kind of a symbol of the cyclical nature of life and change and fungibility itself. Then it also is a place of like grounding and connection. In popular culture, there's a lot of talk about that, whether it's like our bodies grounding into the earth as a kind of way of connecting and healing, or even just in a more practical sense, how we structure our homes with big pipes going into, or, you know, metal into the ground to ground them and discharge them. So I think I'm interested in, on a larger scale in my work, disrupting boundaries and categories, and our tendency to think of reality as these discrete objects that interact with each other but are not contaminated by each other. So I think that dirt does that for me too. And then the third way that I'm thinking about dirt is as a kind of symbolic or social metaphor about dirtiness. So as we've talked about before, I'm a trans person. And so I grew up, you know, a lot of my foundational experience, I grew up in, most of my childhood was in Charleston, West Virginia, which is not the most progressive place in the world. So I grew up with a lot of judgment and shaming, and kind of came to understand the world as this dangerous place that thought I was dirty.
So it's almost a self-portrait through the filter of society.
Yeah, so I identify with this dirt, and I identify with its contamination. It's not just self-portraiture, but I think that's part of the work. And so by taking this dirt that we as a society think of as kind of worthless, and transforming it into something, and then presenting it in the context of, you know, as art in a museum space or in a gallery space, where I'm asking people to join me in seeing it as having value and being worthy of consideration, is a way of subverting these norms about what is clean, what is pure, what is valuable, and even what is beautiful.
Absolutely. Very powerful. When did you first start working with Earth? And when did you, like, do you have your first piece, but also do you have maybe perhaps a favorite piece that you used in this subversion of?
I'll answer the first part first, and sort of what came first. So I was living in New Mexico from 2016 to 2019. And in New Mexico, the entire environment, I was living in Gallup, which is a small town of 20,000 people on the border of the Navajo Nation, very rural, and without like much modern development. So all around me all the time, there was exposed dirt and rock, and that came to be sort of my like normal way of seeing the world. And when I moved to Los Angeles in the summer of 2019, so not that long ago, I was really struck by how the dirt was invisible. And I found myself kind of missing the dirt and being really like disoriented by how it was concealed. So one day I was driving to my studio, which is in South Los Angeles County in Hawthorne. I drove by this giant pile of dirt, exposed dirt with these chunks of asphalt around it. And I just sort of stopped and got out of my car and I was staring at it. And I felt like it was one of those moments, they happen occasionally for me, where I feel like I have stumbled across accidental art. It's like a found sculpture.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I was looking at it and really kind of moved by it. There was a sort of violence implied by how the surface had been broken, but there was also a kind of really rugged, raw beauty for me in just seeing the dirt. And so I decided then that I needed to work with this dirt in some way. And I started, I got permission to collect some of it and I brought it back to my studio and I started researching how can you work with dirt as a sculptural material and experimenting with different methods. And I ended up doing a performance working with this material so that people could kind of see it in different stages, you know, see it in its raw state as just kind of crumbly dirt, see it as mud, and then ultimately see it brought together in a sort of temporary body in a sculptural form. And so since I was kind of hooked after that, and all of the different kinds of meanings that can be made out of it really continue to kind of bounce around inside of me and push me and excite me to continue working with it. Sure.
In that first moment, when you first saw this found sculpture, did you already have that inclination of almost that self-portraiture aspect, or was that something that occurred later?
No, I think like I engage with, my process is very materials driven and very like physical, and there's an element of like emotion and searching and investigation and all of these things. So there's often not like you don't have like a finished object in mind when I start off in a new direction. And so that aspect of that like read of this work came when I discovered that the dirt was contaminated.
Oh, very interesting. Okay.
So when I first started working with it, I was thinking about it more as like, I feel disjointed from the earth. I feel disoriented and sort of, I know that when I can touch this dirt, it makes me feel a certain way. And that feels important. And I want to start there and make from there. And of course, I should have realized that this dirt was contaminated. It's been dug out from underneath an industrial site. And so there was like some awareness, I think, that this was not like pristine dirt.
I like the oxymoron on that.
Right, if there is such a thing. But that it was, what'd you say?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for,
Yeah.
I appreciate your vulnerability.
Thank you. I feel like vulnerability is an important part of my practice, and one thing that I can do in my life that I think can have an impact. And you know, it can be about disclosing things about my personal life and how I think they relate to the world. But I've been spending some time, like, as I've been preparing to talk with you today, thinking about queerness and the Anthropocene and pollution and toxicity and how they're all related. And I think that vulnerability is a good word for it. So when I think about what are the sort of forces that have led to the sort of mass pollution of our planet, and what are the forces that have led to the subjugation and judgment of trans and queer people, I see overlap. I see this like will to domination.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so how do we respond to domination? Like we could try to dominate ourselves, but I don't think that's really the answer, you know?
And
Like
I
if
think,
we, go ahead.
oh no, please, no, you were.
It's just that if we can find our own vulnerability, then we can start to and identify the vulnerability in the earth and the planet and in others around us. I think that we can create a kind of collective shift where we don't see ourselves as these separate categories of people. You know, we're not these silos of issues, environmentalism versus racism versus transphobia versus colonialism, like they're all tied together. And if we can kind of get into a place of vulnerability and humility in ourselves, I think that we might be able to access empathy for each other. Absolutely. And so I hope that my work and my practice and like also me talking about my work and practice can be you know, one small kind of contribution in that direction.
And I appreciate it, and I very much agree with you that vulnerability is the way to move forward, to make it's I hope that a lot of these issues that we have in the planet are from ignorance, and if through accessing empathy, human empathy, I hope will be the lever that in the machine that we need to utilize for change.
I have been reading this book. I'm going to mention it. I don't think I have it on my shelf right now. It's behind me, but it's this book and an essay by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick within a book called Touching Feeling. And the essay is called Paranoid Reading versus Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You, which is an amazing title.
Such a good title.
But she talks about how so much of contemporary life is located in this kind of paranoid view where we're deconstructing things and we're suspicious. Like we approach everything from this position of suspicion. And not that that's always unfounded or never useful, but that we've kind of lost the ability to approach each other from a position of openness and vulnerability, and that we're attempting to avoid humiliation at all costs instead of make connections and build something together. And it's just, you know, these are kind of like easy things to say out loud, but it's really struck me as like a fresh way of thinking about how I engage with the world, but also, you know, my practice and like what kind of force I want to be in the world.
Well, I think you're doing a damn good job of being a force of good, Ashton.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share the work through with you and through the Torrance Art Museum too, because it, you know, and through this show, and to kind of bring this perspective to the conversation about the Anthropocene.
Well, I think that part two of the question kind of went sideways, and I asked if you had a favorite piece of your work that you've done.
I think that often when things are going well, your most recent piece is your favorite piece. So the work that I have in the show that is subtitled Specimen, I'm excited about. I think it does something of capturing these objects of contemporary life, and it's beautiful and simple and quiet and small, but I think it's impactful for that reason. And I like the dirt work when it's not pretending to be anything other than dirt, but there is something sensual in it and tactile and where people can approach it as beautiful. I realize, of course, that's a really subjective response, but I'm looking for that in my own reaction to the work, to take these materials, to take, you know, refuse and dirt and pollution itself and present it as something mysterious and full.
Yeah, I really do like the catch and release specimens, at not only on a thematic level, but on an aesthetic level. Like you said, like they're very pretty. Like I like the fact that it's 3 pieces, and the metal presentation underneath that gives like almost like a not to say messy, but like it's like a messy reflect, like it's not a full reflection, but it's got a hint of a reflection of the piece, and it's very well done, both on the thematic, like you create something poignant and meaningful, but it's also beautiful and elegant. You had actually pointed out to me in that piece that there's a little plastic toy dinosaur in it, which I particularly liked. I think it's kind of cheeky, the fact that little dinosaur toy is made out of petroleum, and petroleum has dinosaur bones in it. So I found that piece really great. When you choose your objects for your work, what do you look for? Is there something aesthetic? Is there something thematic? Is something that catches your eye?
Yeah, I think like I'm interested in the conceptual content of objects, but also their formal properties or aesthetic properties. I appreciate that reading of the Dino, and not something that had occurred to me consciously, but really fascinating how the plastics that were kind of are the cheap currency of so much of kind of contemporary life are ultimately products of oil, which is ultimately a kind of geological process of deep time. But I was thinking, I was thinking with the Dino. Oh, I call it a Dino because I have a 5-year-old, so it's like 5-year-old lingo for that, I guess. So I was thinking with the dinosaur in that sculpture of this sort of creating this opportunity for this strange experience of approaching this sort of ambiguous chunk of dirt that has a piece of something coming out, and then maybe recognizing that it had a relationship with a dinosaur, and then this like dissonance of realizing, okay, we're very used to seeing dinosaurs or dinosaur fossils in the dirt, but this is not a fossil. This is actually kind of a fossil of now.
Oh yeah, that's very true. It's going to be our fossils because plastic is near eternal, unfortunately.
Right. So there's going to be some time where, you know, the sort of would-be archaeologists of the deep future are carving or digging down into the surface of the planet, and they'll get to one layer where there are artifacts and fossils of our time, which might contain these sort of strange references to prehistoric time, and of course then digging further into the layer where there are the actual fossils. So I was interested in that kind of the kind of tension or that kind of reference. And then also I think because it's a children's toy, it does for me something, it evokes for me a kind of like innocence and also grief that I feel when I think about the future and what's important, what's happening, and what will come. So, but I don't just work with toys, and I don't just work with plastic, and I don't just work with dinosaurs. Like in the work that's in the show, there's also some objects from offices, like a Scotch tape dispenser, and these kind of like metal clips, and then also some obsolete or near obsolete technology, including audiovisual cables. And so with those, I'm thinking again about this tension between like sort of the everyday lives that we kind of take for granted and think of as really real and kind of permanent, whether it's like our boring office jobs or you know, this sort of like glamour of technology, and putting it within the dirt as a way of signaling its impermanence as well, and trying to like help myself and give the viewer an opportunity to think of, to put it in the context of the planet and something like geological time.
Absolutely. I like that you're also transforming these objects too, that these
Yeah,
objects are created into art by you reforming their purpose and their utility.
yeah, I think that ambiguity is an important goal in my work. And so when I work with objects, I do try to use them in a way that complicates them or obscures their identity a little bit. So when we, and I think that's like an important part of the content of my work overall. If we engage with the world from this position of like wanting to label everything, I think that, you know, from like an early age, we're enculturated to do that. Like we kind of scan our surroundings, identify what's there, categorize it, dismiss it, and move on. And I think art can be one of those places where that kind of like routine, habituated way of interacting with the world can be challenged. And I like to think that challenging that can be really powerful. Like, can art be a place in a way where we learn how to be with uncertainty.
I think so. I think it's very powerful. I also see a great dichotomy aesthetically in your work, which is another thing that drew me to your sculptural work. I like that you have these very organic shapes in with the earth, and then you have very clean lines when you're looking at the mass-produced debris. Was that sort of aesthetic on purpose? Or
Yes, I think that one of the places that I'm kind of starting with, one of the places I'm starting from with this work is this sense that the natural world is not really separate from the human world or from culture or from the quote man-made. I think we kind of grow up with this sense of this dichotomy, and first of all, it's not scientifically the case. But second of all, I think that way of looking at the world is part of what's gotten us into this ecological mess that we're in.
yeah.
And so by combining these human-made objects and artifacts with organic materials, I am imagining that the work is demonstrating the continuity of these two, of what we think of as separate realms.
I really like that. That's a very good way to approach the Anthropocene and what we're doing to our planet. Thematically, your work invokes incredibly important social and environmental concepts. What is it important to you when you're making your artwork to consider it environmental art, or that's just a byproduct of what you're feeling and trying to express?
So it is. I think I am interested in ambiguity, but I'm also interested in the world. And it's not satisfying for me to make art that is so disconnected from society and the world and the planet, that it has no accessible relationship to it. And so there are like different things that I do to try to make that connection accessible. And one is by choosing the materials that I choose, and another is by, how I present them and how I talk about them. But environmentalism is also really foundational to sort of my understanding of reality and what's important and the world that we live in. So I mentioned earlier that I grew up mostly in Charleston, West Virginia, and it's the capital of the state and the biggest city in the state. It's not a large city, and at least when I was growing up, it had this nickname of Chemical Valley.
Wow.
So like many places in the world where there's a lot of poverty, Charleston was home to an incredible density of chemical processing plants when I was growing up. And so my grandfather was a chemist at Union Carbide his whole life, my mother's father, and the house that I grew up in, when you looked out the main window from the living room, you saw at the sort of the valley at the bottom of the hill, this sprawling complex of chemical processing
Wow.
factories, plants. So I remember at night, like you never really could see the stars because this combination of air pollution and light pollution from these plants painted the sky pink all night long.
That's horrifying. And sounds kind of pretty if it wasn't coming from such a terrible place.
Had a haunting beauty to it.
Yeah.
So like my mother grew up there, and she would tell stories about growing up in, you know, the 50s and 60s and 70s, and having these at her school they had, you know, the fire drills that we're familiar with, and then they had like the nuclear bomb raid drills, and then they had the chemical leak drills, and there were like separate bells for all of them and separate things that they did, and it wasn't unusual, and like sometimes there were chemical leaks. And the rates of cancer and other diseases in this area, not surprisingly, are really, really high.
I can imagine.
And and I lost my mother to cancer at a pretty young age. I just, you know, I don't share it lightly, just to kind of give the context of this place, and like, you know, how it's informed my understanding of the world. And so pollution, toxicity has always been really visible in my mind, but it's also always been tied to humanity and what it does to people, what are the social aspects that contribute to it, and what are the consequences for, you know, real people and their bodies and their lifespans. I think this idea of toxicity and contamination and its relationship to me, for me, with social judgment and taboo is also really foundational throughout. So I'm trying in this like what I think of as like a really queer way to bring together a lot of different conversations that are all, you know, very present in my life and world into this work, without like closing the work down or being really literal or being really didactic about it, because that's not satisfying for me, and I don't think it's really effective either.
The fact that your work has so much pathos in it, in a way that is accessible, yet in a way that is intelligent, and you need to search for it, I think it's a great service what you're doing. Like it's really beautiful and strong and poignant, the artwork that you create, and your mom would be very proud. So your mom is obviously one of your influences. What are artistically and emotionally, what are some things that influence you as an artist?
So there was a show at the Pompidou that I did not get to see, but it was about form and formlessness, the formless. And in that show, the curators collected like a couple generations of artists from different parts of the world, from Asia, from America, from Europe, painters and sculptors and indigenous artists, who were working with this edge between form and formlessness. And I saw a lot, I identified a lot with like this kind of framing of contemporary art. So there was, you know, Smithson in there, and his asphalt pour, but also the Italian artist, Fontana. Luciano Fontana. He just had like a retrospective of his installation and light work at Hauser and Wirth in downtown LA, but he's more famous for these like slashed paintings. And then artists like Richard Serra with Thrown Lead. And so I think that, you know, there's a way of understanding this as being like a very trans queer interest, but I think it's bigger than that, and that's why it's interesting to present it as as art. But this edge between the where something we think of as a form or a body it disintegrates into something that's more shared and communal, and then also how that can come back into form. So I think about them, and then I also like think about my experiences with travel and ritual and music. I got to spend some time in India when I was younger, and sit through a concert of classical Hindustani music in an ashram in Varanasi. And I trained as a jazz musician as an adolescent, and I was so, yeah. I think that I played the saxophone in that context, but I also played the piano and the guitar and the violin in other ways. Are you a musician too?
I'm not a musician, but I do love jazz. I think it's such a beautiful music form. I love music, period. But
yeah, it was formative for me, and I think in some ways, like I'm still playing music just with dirt now, you know.
It's
But
beautiful.
yeah, the being in your body and being with your you know, spirit, being with and honoring your inner emotional life, and then being in the moment and incorporating improvisation. Those are all things that I kind of learned as a musician that I still really value and incorporate in my practice now. But so when I was in India and I got to sit through this performance, I was really dumbfounded, really affected, really like just so impressed by what I had experienced. And part of that was the fact that it was improvisational. Part of it was that it was done in this space that was sort of set aside. There was the role of rhythm and ritual in it. All of these things kind of influenced how what I saw as possible and like relevant and within, like, expanded my view of what art can be. And I could come up with like I could list other examples from kind of time abroad. But I think that is with me too, and with my practice and like what influences me. My father was a sailor.
Ahoy.
Ahoy. So that was his job. He raced sailboats for other people.
Oh, how cool. My dad sold boats.
Nice.
So my dad and your dad would have worked very close. Like, I know exactly that job.
Yeah. So he was, you know, he loved it. It like brought him life. And I don't know how this happened exactly, but somehow he was allowed to like bring me along a lot. My mom was a flight attendant, so she was traveling internationally part of the week, every week when I was a child. And so my father was my primary parent in the earliest part of my life. And I have some of my earliest memories are being taken along with him to to work, and like race sailboats and just being on the sea and being literally physically moved around, and like the rhythms of the sea, how that felt in my body, and that sort of like calm of that space, but the expansiveness of it, and the way that the wind moves you. And so I think that sense of being small in the context of this larger ecological, like environmental space that is both really peaceful, but also capable, very powerful, has stayed with me. That sense has stayed with me.
It's the funny thing is, I think of that sensation when looking at the stars, but I completely relate to that as the ocean as well. Like the ocean, it's, instead of looking out, it's almost, I feel like it's almost like a looking in of that feeling. So you're looking at our planet and having that, I'll have to look it up. There's got to be a word for that. It's like some sort of existentialism, and that feeling of being tiny and part of everything at the same time. That's very interesting that you mentioned that. Like, I love that feeling too, and it's very interesting to like think about it when a different force is producing that feeling. Yeah, it's definitely one of my inspirations with my practice, is that feeling too.
Yeah, I think I think sometimes it's called the sublime.
Bravo. Yes, absolutely.
But like the sublime in a romantic sense of looking at Niagara Falls or something is one thing, but then I think that experience is accessible now as part of understanding what humanity is doing. You know, there is a smallness to our own vulnerability to the toxicity that is being caused by human activity.
Very true. And with that, Ashton, unfortunately, that is a perfect way to end this interview, I think. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I wish I had more time to talk.
Yes,
Always
you too. Thank you.
Your thoughts. You are a very intelligent person, and you are also a very kind and good person. So, always a pleasure.
Thank you,
for
Hope.
sharing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing you and your work, and I loved having you in Rewilding Structures.
I'm very
Have a
grateful
lovely
to
afternoon.
be a part of it. Thank you. You too.